Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. This podcast is a podcast that discusses esotericism and religion, and seeks to help people develop a healthy spirituality in the chaos of the postmodern world. In this episode, I have a guest on the show. She is someone who has recently been working on a book, and she does some teachings. I will have her explain who she is in a second. The idea that this show is going to be based around is witchcraft. We haven't done an episode on witchcraft in a while. So I think it'd be good to kind of get to that and exploring this idea of what the witch path is, the archetype of the witch wound, and how to use witchcraft to sort of transform your life and help you heal from certain wounds within yourself. I think this would be a very interesting conversation. Can you introduce yourself, tell who you are, what you do, and a bit about your spiritual path and beliefs?
Definitely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. I've been listening to your show, and wow, you cover such a wide variety of topics that it's just such a pleasure to be here. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Um,
Thank you.
right. So I'll start with an introduction. My name is Tahverlee, and I'm a high priestess, a practicing witch, the founder of the Moon Temple Mystery School. And I have a YouTube channel and a podcast, and definitely a forthcoming book. It might be out by the time this is aired, which I'm really excited about. And I will say that my passion, my mission, my purpose is to show people how to step into their greatest power. And the word witch is either repelling to a lot of people or it is a reclamation of all the ways in which a lot of people have conformed, right? Conformed to be small. And so it's my purpose, my passion to help people truly wake up their power. And I do it through the archetype of the witch.
Yeah, I think witch historically, it's we're talking about a loaded term, right? Like it's one that has a lot of historic weight behind it, and it's a archetype that has been really attacked against historically. And you see this really interesting shift, where people are embracing this term of witchcraft. And obviously, that's been going on for, the better part of a century at this point. But I think it's still interesting to explore like why this term appeals. Because we think about witch, like I think a lot of people think witch equal person who does magic, but I think that archetype is actually a bit more specific and a bit more complex. Can you sort of explore what you would define as the archetype of the witch so we know kind of where we're coming from?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you asked that because I'm sure if you asked 100 different practicing witches, their definition of being a witch would mean something different. And it really is kind of a fascinating topic. And I like to just boil it down really simple for me and the way that I teach is that being a witch just means being in control, like choosing how you want to live your life, choosing how you want to create connections to the elements, to nature, to creating change in your life, to casting spells or not casting spells, because truly not all witches cast spells, but there is this commonality amongst witches of being in control of themselves. And, there's lots of different ways in which that shows up in our real 3D life. And I like that you brought up that it's kind of been evolving and people have been embracing it more. And I know not a lot of people, not a lot of practicing witches love the fact that all these new witches are kind of waking up and want to play with crystals and tarot. And I just laugh and say, yes, let's do more of that because it's always going to be an entryway into knowing that you have greater choice, greater power. So, my definition is quite simple.
That's a really interesting way to put it. I've never heard it quite explained that way, and I really like that because when I think about people who come to esotericism, who come to like witchcraft and whatnot, I think we are seeing a lot of people, who get interested in this stuff, who kind of do feel that they lack control in their lives. And I think psychologically, I mean, that's something a lot of people struggle with as well, is that out of control feeling. And if we're defining witch as something about control, we're really tapping into like the idea of the power of the will, and some really kind of deeper metaphysical ideas. So I actually really love that.
Yes, and I like that you mentioned that because isn't that sort of where we might see spirituality and witchcraft coincide or cross paths? Is I think of it like the spiritual path is, creating alignment, clearing blocks, being in connection, right? Being centered. Whereas a witch does that as well, but takes it maybe a step further to take that alignment to God, the goddess, any deity, any spirit, and uses it to create something better in their life. And I really love this topic because to me spirituality and witchcraft intersect in really interesting ways depending on the witch. Of course, I mean I can't speak for everyone. I can only speak for what I teach, but I do think that they go hand in hand, and that power of choice is to me, I talk about it in the introduction of my book, that the power of choice is our superpower. But most people forget that they have it all the time, every minute of the day, all the time.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've talked about this as like mass dissociation. So I think currently right now people are trying to dissociate or disconnect from their lives, right? People are unhappy and their solution to that is to detach and release everything and kind of just let life pass them by. And this leads to such deep unhappiness in people. It's really sad to see. And I think, where witchcraft can be good is that it is people, taking actual agency and control, because while you can't control everything in your life, if you understand, the power of the will within the self, and I do have a lot of past in Thelema, so that's probably why I think so much about the will, but you can actually do so much more than people think they can. And I like the way you're putting it because you're right. Understanding this control is a way towards healing and getting out of these traps that so many people live in.
I mean, you're just talking my language. It's so true. And the disassociation pieces, I mean, that's so interesting. We could talk for a long time about that. I do think that for some people, even on the spiritual path, that disassociation, or even in different pagan traditions, that disassociation happens because there's this idea that if I just meditate and stay in alignment, everything is just going to happen. Right. So there's no choice, there's no ownership. And you used the word agency, and I love that word because that's radical accountability, is to truly have agency. And accountability and choice, same, although that word doesn't seem to hit as nicely. Accountability doesn't hit as nicely as choice for most people.
But yeah, no, you're right. Because, when you are on a spiritual path, I think something that people forget is that, I think people see enlightenment or gnosis or whatever you want to call it, right? Spiritual breakthroughs as something that like happens one time. And that's not correct because, it's not like you like do one ritual and like, you're good, right? It's a continuous journey, which is why I love the phrasing of spiritual journey or witchcraft journey, because that implies this continuation, because I do think
Mhm.
you're right. I think some people like pick up one practice and they're like, okay, well, I'm good. And they're not taking that agency. They're not using the word accountability, which is a harsher word, but it might actually be worth using in this situation because it sort of
Mhm.
brings it home a bit.
I,
Yeah, I mean,
I
it's constant.
I do like to say things that bite sometimes, so fair warning. Yeah, accountability is a good word. So I teach it as the spiral path of magic, right? And my book is book 1, which is the element of earth to the north. So starting with that, deep connection to yourself, to your truth, to your beliefs. And there's so much that happens when you start realizing that everything is a choice. It's almost like it's like you're pulling on the string at the bottom of a sweater, and when you start realizing, accountability and choice, and you start pulling on that string, it's like everything unravels. I mean, really, that's witch work. I mean, you can do rituals and spells, but when you do them from a place of understanding that everything you're doing is a choice, it's almost like you realize that 1 hour that you do the ritual or the spell is less of consequence than the 23 other hours that you spend in the day. And then that seems to just oftentimes for a lot of people just melts their mind because they're like, "Can you just give me the spell? Can you give me the love spell? Can you give me the spell to create this thing, or how do I manifest this thing?" And really, to me, at the core, it's deeper than that. To walk, live, and breathe as a witch is to understand that everything is connected. Everything you do is connected. Everything you do is either creating, changing, or canceling, or not, depending on how you live.
Yeah, I remember I heard this, and I think it's a Kabbalistic phrasing. I'm pretty sure of the phrasing of there is no separation. And I think that idea is kind of overwhelming. But the truth is, everything is both spiritual and material at the same time. It's not actually like this dichotomy, right? Like, we do ritual for specific purposes, we do spells for specific purposes, but everything else is still a metaphysical experience, right? We are never not having a metaphysical experience, because if you buy into, which I think most people who are witch do, right? The idea that there is, a spiritual quality to this world, there are sort of layers of existence, right? Those inevitably have to be happening all at the same time, right? All at once. That whole all is one, like, short summation, it implies really complicated things. And I like that you're saying this, because I do think a lot of people, they want like a quick fix, right? They want to do like one spell, one ritual, and it be done. But the thing is, that discounts that, yeah, everything is a spiritual experience at all times, it is overwhelming. It's completely overwhelming. But at the same time, I think there's a comfort to it, right? Because that also means that at no moment are we like disconnected to our gods and our goddesses, right? It's kind of a beautiful thing, if not a little bit sublime, kind of like when you stare up at the sky, see all the stars, and it gives you that little bit of comfort, but also kind of existential, overwhelmingness, right? It's that kind of sensation.
Yeah, because then what do you do? I mean, how do you make it less metaphysical and more in the material, which is always the question. And I think that those steps along the way of what you're referring to is looking at that big picture and then seeing that you're small and then realizing, is there a point? And then realizing, oh, there is a point because I'm human in a body and having a spiritual experience. And yet I'm human and I'm choosing. Okay, so then I'm back to the whole big picture again. And I think that that cycle brings you into realizing that is the path of enlightenment, is to realize that everything is spiritual and material, at least for now. While we're here in these bodies, they are. And if we know that to be true, well, then what do we do with that? I mean, this is just a little free time in my brain right there.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the big question that we're all discovering. And I think, a good step towards discovering that is, doing spiritual things, going down this path. You mentioned that you use this term, the spiral path. So after that, know thyself's kind of beginning phase, what goes next on that path that you teach?
Hmm. So, right, we're starting in the north, which is knowing how everything is connected, your body, nature, understanding the vibration of elements, understanding the material versus the non-material worlds. I call it asking the great big question of, is this all there is? So that's what we do sitting in the north. And when we move to the east in the element of air, then we take it into the mental plane of our mind and our beliefs. And again, it's that unwinding of that little thread that we pull out of the bottom of a sweater, which is exploring all the beliefs you've been told, everything you've been led to believe that takes you to the path towards success and happiness. We unwind it first, and then we rebuild it with this inner knowing that you are choosing, and turning on access to ancient wisdom in your body, turning on access to ancient wisdom in nature, and then starting to see that form into the non-material and material, which is the body and the mind, how they play, right? The earth is the body, the element of air is our mind and our beliefs. And then when we move to the south, which is fire, that's our sovereignty and our passion and our spirit. So we take the first two steps, which is, okay, let me explore how everything's connected and am I connected to my body? And then, okay, what have I been taught to believe? And is everything that I believe about myself and the world what I want it to be? If not, I change it. Then we move to the south and we're like, okay, I've been to the north. I understand the element of earth. I understand my beliefs and what I want to redo. Now, what do I want? Now, what do I like truly want to experience? And then, of course, when we move to the west and into water, we're talking about making it all fluid. So we move from the material to the non material with ease. And of course, everything then becomes connected again because it's water, which is our body, which is the planet, which is all of our emotions. And so it anchors in the spiral path. And you can find yourself in any of those elements pretty much, especially assuming you identify as a woman. I identify as a woman. Especially as women, we find ourselves sitting in different elements throughout the day, in different times, all the time. And then we can see those cycles that happen in the day, in the week, and the months. We can sync them to the moon. We can sync them to rituals. And then we go back to the north again and see ourselves back in our body after we've processed all the first journey around the elemental wheel. And then we come back to our body again and we just do it again.
That's a really cool way of explaining it because those are kind of like the different components that are part of, spiritual discovery. So, would how it work is you go through the spiral and then you go through it again, kind of on like a more evolved level, or by sort of asking those questions again to yourself. Is that kind of how it does when you go back through it?
I think yes, sometimes it's not as nice and pretty as okay, I'm in the north and I'm working on my connection to my body and then I'm exploring my beliefs and then I'm choosing and then I'm flowing. It doesn't really often work like that. What usually happens is we have experiences that come up in real human life, as you know, that thrust us into one place or the other, where we're kind of, maybe navigating some of the underworld and navigating some old patterns or old beliefs or even just trauma that comes our way, and we have to find our way in the wheel, which is why I teach it this way, is because you can truly find where you're at in any situation, any relationship, or any part of your life, on an elemental wheel, which to me is the core basis of how I teach witchcraft. And once you find yourself, well, you can explore that area on that part of the wheel, but you can also then really understand how rituals and spells come into play. Because when you know where you're sitting at any time on, let's say, the spiral path, then you know what you need to bring in to create balance. And again, because we're always choosing, we can choose to bring balance in wherever we're at. And I really truly wish that it was this smooth ride, I'll say upwards, right, from the human plane up through into the high cosmic plane of spirals, because we keep spiraling up. There's always another level and always another level. But I feel like it's a little bit more like pinballs sometimes bouncing around.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I feel like when I explain like different because every tradition, has their own way of kind of describing like spiritual evolution. It always does look much neater than when you're actually doing it. Like I feel like spirituality instead of, like a chart, like it's not like a line up, it's like a bumpy line that vaguely goes and trends upwards, you know what I mean? Because we're
Yeah.
always like we take a step forward, we take a half step back. Like, there's always sort of complications to it because what I find happens is the more I go down my journey, the more I progress, right? The more I discover things that I didn't notice before are impediments, right? Like I see more within my shadow that I'm like, "Oh boy, that needs to be addressed," right? So it's interesting because, as you continue to do the work, you continue to grow, it seems like more things come up, which is good because that means you're discovering more about yourself. Because I think when people are new, right, to the path, there's a lot that they don't know, right? There's a lot that, like, even when you're in that early, like, trying to understand yourself phase, there's some stuff that's just so deep in there, so deep in that lunar, watery quality of the self that, like, you can't even identify that early on. And so, yeah, the journey is, I mean, it's hard, right? It's complicated, but it's
Mhm.
rewarding. So it kind of ends up being worth it in the end.
You are so correct. And I mean, look at me. A lot of people look at me as this, professional witch that has, big platforms and talks about witchcraft all the time. But you know what? I mess it up all the time. I don't always get it right. And my book actually includes a lot of stories of times when I wasn't, in this neat little round spiral, but I was instead, really struggling to figure out this piece of my life. And it didn't take away from the power I held and my ability to choose. What it did was force me to do things like rest or go more inward, right? I mean, we never I don't think that we ever stop having the opportunity to access another level. And to me, the next level that we access is just what you talked about, which is always going to be deeper levels into your shadow, which can be beliefs, can be, trauma, can be parts of your body, can be your family beliefs. In fact, I was just working on a part of my audiobook today, and I was speaking about a section of how we every time we learn something really wonderful about ourselves, most of the time it comes from learning something really hard about ourselves. Like there's almost that precursor all the time of, oh, there's another level, there's another shadow, and learning to say, okay, great. That was a shadow. Now I get to learn. Because again, that's the choice. Many people just bury it. Nope, I'm not going to look at that shadow. I'm not going to look at any of that. I don't want to know. It's too hard. It's too painful. And that is not usually what people expect when we start talking about walking the path as a witch. And yet, that is, shadows are a part of the path.
Oh yeah, and we're humans. I mean, no matter how like ascended and enlightened like a person looks, or how sort of, further they've been down the path than you, like as long as we are living human beings, right? There's more work we have to do. I don't believe someone can fully, unite with the gods and be completely, ascended or whatever in this lifetime. I just don't think it's possible. I think that, as long as you are within a body, right, that's not there. But the point of it is not to hear that and then like give up and be like, oh well, fuck this if I'm not going to wake up, perfect witch tomorrow. The point is the journey itself and getting closer and closer, right? Getting closer and closer in and of itself is worth something. And I mean, yeah, within our shadows, there are often silver linings. This is another thing, is something I've noticed the more I've explored metaphysics and esotericism and witchcraft, is there are these contradictions that appear to be contradictions but actually aren't, right? Like within the shadow there is good things, or within severity there is mercy, right? Within light there is dark, right? These things don't make sense when you first hear them, but the more you kind of understand the nuances of it and have these actual metaphysical experiences that, you can't really describe a metaphysical experience and have someone understand it. It's just kind of hard to do that. Um, you get that, right? So when like I recently had an event in my life that thrust me deep into my shadow, and it was, a very challenging thing. And I actually, the thing that I realized was a good thing about myself, I originally was like, oh, that's a horrible flaw, that's something I need to drop. But with time I was like, no, this is actually a mechanism that has a complete purpose and is a core of my actual self. And so you can really discover a lot through these challenging experiences. And that's why, like, when people are doing rituals, things like exploring their shadows or crossing the abyss or whatever are rituals that people opt to do, even if they are seemingly really difficult experiences.
Mm, hmm. Yeah, and thanks for sharing. You've experienced some shadows recently. I think that there is a lot of power in us sharing that. Even people who are sitting in leadership roles and giving an example of what it's like to do the work that you're doing, especially here on the show, that the shadows come because there's one thing I know to be true 100%, and that's that if you don't have any shadows, you're not standing in the light.
Yes, exactly. Even literally. That's even one of
Hmm.
those things where, like, you see it materially and you're like, oh, that's just, a thing. But it exists metaphysically. I mean, certain physical properties. Like if you're standing in the sun, there's a shadow there, right?
Hmm.
That is true on every level. Now, one thing you talk about that I'm very curious about is this idea of the witch wound. What is that?
Hmm. Such a great, interesting topic. The witch wound shows up primarily for women, but not always. I mean, there's a lot of men that come through mystery school where I teach where I see this coming up because they have felt it in either the mother whose womb that they, were raised in, or in their family, but they have this reaction to the witch wound as well. And the witch wound can show up in a multitude of ways. We see it primarily when we are keeping ourselves small, right? Like even just as an example, and I there's usually about 5 categories that I like to look at for the witch wound, but really we see it quite often in the area of making ourselves small to fit in. The witch wound shows up in a lot of religious traditions because if we go way back, that power that exists within women that has been confronted, stifled. Women have been small. I mean, you can almost like trace it like a lineage, right? And that doesn't even go into accounting for the amount of women that have died for being accused of being witches, for the amount of neighbors that have had to claim that their neighbor was a witch or their family would be harmed, right? Like we've been the persecutors, we've been the victims. I mean, we've all experienced, or in our family line, our ancestral line, we've been all parts of the spectrum. And so those are two ways that you can start to see it, but how it shows up mostly in today's society, especially as we go into 2025, how that shows up, regardless of where the originating factor was, is in women making themselves small and being afraid to speak up, be sovereign, or stand for themselves in any way, like to be big, to take up space. All of that starts to unearth. And, I just listed, hours and hours worth of conversation about what's possible, but that's kind of how we gently start getting into the witch wound, because when people realize that their fear of being seen, even on something so small like social media, I see it all the time with a lot of my clients. Being small on social media is probably a sign that you're still processing that witch wound from multi generations of women that have been afraid to be seen.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it all roots back in that removal of the divine feminine, right? Because, when we look at metaphysics in the ancient world, right, the divine feminine and the divine masculine were both present, right? You see these
Mhm.
ancient pagan religions from all around the world. I mean, it's pretty universal in different forms, of course, but you see god and goddesses, right? You see both, and you see both being understood as vitally important things. And then you get into the Abrahamic religions, and the divine feminine, while it is still there, I'm not gonna, say it's not there, has been shrunk way down. And I think this lacking of the divine feminine and this lacking of, that entire energy that is, 50% of creation itself, 50% of metaphysics itself, it's a denial of so much of what exists in the universe, what exists in metaphysical law, that it disorients people. Like, I see so many women, they get jaded from some sort of experience with a religious group that they felt uncomfortable in, and they just abandon all spirituality entirely. They're like, okay, well,
Mm.
this isn't for me, this is not got a path for me. And it's very, very unfortunate and sad to see, but I do think witchcraft is a way for people to connect to the divine feminine, and I think that's why it's become more popular, right? I think a lot of women want that divine feminine connection, and they don't know where else to find it. And obviously, like, witchcraft, I mean, even the term witch, right, the term witch is obviously not like a male female term, but it is most associated with women, right?
Mhm.
And I think there's something relatable in that. I think that archetype connects people even just on that level.
You just summarized that way better. I was very wordy. That was very good. I liked it. You know, that is, the divine feminine is definitely one piece of where we see witch wounding, but it's not the only one. There's another area that we see a lot of witch wounding exist, and that's, the sister wound, right? The competition that we've been raised with to look at your friends, your community, or your classmates as, they can't be better than me, because if they're better than me, then I'm going to be lower. Like that competition that exists between women now, we see that a lot in adult women that have a hard time making friends. It's because of this conditioning that if they're powerful, I can't be. That them in their power, them at their best, takes away from something for me. That's also a witch wound. And that can be traced back to all the ways in which, women were persecuted, women were had to tell on each other, right, to the authorities, or their family would be at risk. That sister wounding piece goes deep for a lot of women. In fact, I would say in my communities, sister wounding is probably 50% of the deep belief wounding that we heal on the witch path.
Yeah, I mean, there's that idea of, you know, disliking people around you or seeing them as competition. I think this is a widespread thing. And I mean, our culture does encourage it, right? Even on
Mhm.
social media, right? We have all these numbers around our names, right? And we see people as up against us. And I think women are very prone to this. I mean, I've heard the term intrasexual competition used, which is like kind of women on women, that pettiness, that malice, right? Attacking other women for their appearances, all of that. And we're kind of all tending to do that. And it is unhealthy, and it's bad if you're doing it because it stems from envy, all these emotions. And when we think about those emotions, right, a lot of them have roots in spiritual maladies of the heart, certain spiritual dysfunctions, and they can do things like send the evil eye, do all sorts of spiritual things that we're not even realizing, because as we've discussed earlier, everything is connected. And so when you have this idea that you need to cut all other women down, right, that actually has spiritual consequences to it, and it, wounds you further, right? Because it isolates you.
Mhm.
You can't see women as your sisters, as your community. So you end up lonely and sad. It's a horrible state of affairs. And I think that it does. It adds to a metaphysical wound.
Mhm. Yes, definitely. I aim to build communities where we can work on that together. In the high priestess path, for example, we have high priests and high priestesses, but we get to see this play out in real time with each other over the course of many months in temple space and learning the ancient rituals. And we, for a lot of people, can go back in past lives and see where a lot of this originates in us or sometimes in our parents, right? We forget that we carry a lot of that wounding from our mother when we're carried in their womb, right? It's transplanted on us. So we might not even know why. I mean, we can look at, of course, technology and social media and see how we're being programmed to be in competition, but a lot of times it's still so much deeper than that.
Yeah, it goes really deep. Now, when we talk about the witch wound, obviously, the answer is some sort of spiritual healing, I would assume. So,
Mhm.
what would you do to heal the witch wound? What is the step from there if you think you have this wound?
Kind of similar to what I would do with shadow work, which is look at where you're triggered first, right? Like where do you have disharmony around how you view others? It goes back to that, radical accountability piece again. And it's usually an entryway to see yourself. And when you start to see yourself, I mean, you can look at it by where do you judge someone? Where do you judge your sisters? Where do you, or friends? Like, where do you look at another woman and immediately feel that hit of, why are they doing that? Why do they look like that? Why are they wearing that? I don't like that. Or whatever the whole feeling of discomfort you have between yourself and friendships, especially because we're talking about women, where do you feel those moments of discomfort? Those are portholes into your witch wound. And that's just the starting place. That doesn't unravel it. It just tells you where to start. It's like, okay, now I have a roadmap to begin. It's this experience I have with this particular person at work or in my personal life. And when this thing comes up, I feel this way. Great. That's how we start. And then it really is like an excavation of first this lifetime, everything that you've experienced with women in your life, from your friends to your family to your neighbors to school. Once you've explored all that, most of the time it also includes going into the Akashic records and looking at like where else are you carrying wounding from other lifetimes that is a part of your programming that can be addressed now. Like clear those patterns for now, once and for all. And most of the time, that those two steps from this lifetime and visiting the Akash will bring us somewhere to neutral and maybe take some of the charge out of the wounding. The problem is when you get to that neutral state, well, then what? Then it's like you're like fresh again and you need to rebuild the connection with friends or, the idea of sisterhood with a whole fresh new lens. And that itself takes time because a lot of times then you start bumping up against other people that maybe want to redefine your friendship with or make new friends with, and they may not have done what you've done. So then how do you find a place to fit these relationships that for women are so critical that we have other women? It's so critical. We still need to sit by the fire and tell stories and talk about things and share and create and connect. So then, when you're starting to rebuild, there's a whole new series of processes to go through because when we're intentional about rebuilding after we've done the work to do some unwinding, a lot of times it reveals a little bit more wounding that we may not have found the first time around. So it is a journey, it's an evolution like all things on the spiral path. It is a journey and an evolution, and that's just a way to get started in the process, but sometimes it can be easier and sometimes it can be gentler and sometimes it can be super fast depending on how self-aware you are of yourself and what your practices are to navigate your own feelings about yourself.
Yeah, so it kind of sounds like you're describing like a life, death, rebirth type cycle. That's something that
Hmm.
I discuss a lot because it kind of seems like, you're talking about doing all that work and going deep into the shadow. it interesting. It makes me think of like going deep into death and then being reborn with that fresh slate you're talking about. Would you say it kind of tracks onto a life, death,
Yep.
rebirth type understanding?
For sure. And because to me that is the spiral path. Like all things that we do, at least on the witch path, it's it's a continual death and rebirth of yourself. I mean, our body does that naturally all the time. Our cells change over just like it does in nature. Nature goes to sleep, it has a rest, and then is reborn every year. But that's everything on any spiritual path or even on a witch path. I mean, most really good spells and rituals always start with all the things you get rid of and let die before you birth something new. Almost always.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you have to, knock out the weeds in order to plant the flowers. And
Mhm.
I think a lot of people, this is actually a thing I see a lot, is I think I see this more in like the pop spirituality space, but people are really oriented around manifestation and bringing things in, but they don't realize that to bring things in, you need to let things go and you need to
Mm.
release things. And so with witchcraft, with spirituality, we're not just bringing in, we're also culling and removing. And I like that you're incorporating that as a huge part of how you're explaining this, because I think that's an idea that a lot of people miss, because they want endless growth, but you can't have endless growth without release, right? And I like that you're kind of getting into that idea.
I almost always start every single spell work or ritual that I create or give to someone is what do we take away first? Especially in our day-to-day life. Like what do we take away first? Because most people don't even have room to create an enchantable life. Like that's just like we're full up as humans. We're getting hit with stimulation all the time from our phones, from our devices, from social media, from work, from busy schedules, that there isn't even any space to create magic. That that to me for most people creates 90% of the change of any good, especially ceremonial magic, is to make space first and then fill it with what you want. But the making space itself is a ritual. That is magical.
Oh, yeah. And I talk a lot about ritual, right? I do a lot of ceremonial magic, but there's a lot of things that are magical we do that don't really look like rituals, right?
Mm,
And I think people have this idea that to do something magical, you have to have all the pomp and circumstance of it. But that's not true. I mean, there's a lot that you do in your path that doesn't look like mystical, but it still is. And I think we need to like realize that, it's sacred space is not just in that ritual moment.
mhm. Yeah. I recorded a little piece of content for social media just today that said I can tell you how successful your spells and rituals will be, not based upon the spell that you did, but based upon what you did the 23 other hours of that day. And that's basically also what you're saying because everything, again, it goes back to choice. Anything that you do with intention is a type of spell or ritual. You might call it habit or routine, but when you do it with intention, you are continually creating all the time. And it's kind of a deep topic for a lot of people to think about that when you make space, and especially if you learn to sit in stillness and in silence for a period of time every day, which I'm not sure if that's part of your practice, but it is definitely something I teach, is when you create spaciousness. Wow. So many things can happen. But when you're full, you can't. And that to me is ceremonial magic, is making the space in your life to do something very intentional with purpose, with an outcome, with something that's measurable, with a follow up action, with maybe some fancy tools or some fancy music to raise the energy. But really, what you're doing first is making space in your schedule to give intention to something that matters to you. I mean, how often do we see and know people that go by their, day-to-day lives and they don't make intentional space for the things they care about the most? That to me is ceremonial magic.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're just doing ritual and not doing anything else in your life, as I heard someone I know in real life who's not a spiritual person, but they were describing this as life passing people by. And I really like that way of putting it. I think a lot of people let life pass them by. And I think that's the opposite of what we want to do. So if you're just doing ritual and otherwise you're letting life pass you by, you're not actually living in alignment with what those rituals are doing. Because when you do a ritual, right, you're not just lighting candles and incense, you're interacting with the spirit, you are using correspondence, and you're setting intentions that you have to follow through with, right? You can't just open doors and never walk through them and expect things to change. You have to actually live in alignment with it. That's why I talk about true will so much, because true will makes it very clear that this stuff doesn't just exist in ritual, that everything else you do also matters. And so, yeah, I think thinking about the other 23 hours of the day is a really good thing for people to do. I think a contemplation practice is really valuable. And I also think that sitting in silence type practice is valuable too. I think things like meditation, mindfulness, sitting in silence, any variant of those, I don't really care what particularly someone does with it. But I think having any of those is a strong foundation to build a house of a good spiritual practice upon.
It all matters, right? There's a thousand ways. It all matters.
Yes, exactly. So,
Mhm.
what advice would you give to someone who's new to the spiral path, who resonates with what we've been discussing, so that they can actually apply it to their lives, to all 24 hours?
Yeah. Well, of course, pick up my book. That would be a great way to do it. I walk you through a lot of very personal shares, and I have a ton of rituals and spells to do. I think the first thing to do is to go back to what you and I started with, which is to remember that you have choice. You have a lot of choice in your day. You have choice in how you take care of yourself. You have choice in how you see yourself. You have choice in how you connect to your body. And then use that place of choice to decide, what's just the next right step of something that I want to learn about myself. That to me is the beginning places of walking the witch life is what can I do today to learn something more about myself? And that usually leads us to a lot more insight and wisdom than we think is even possible because most of the time, people don't even know themselves. And really, every single human alive on the planet right now has something super amazing to do, some purpose for living, some wish of their soul, some greater idea of what's possible for them. And so explore yourself, go deep. Now, of course, bring all the practices in. And when it comes to things like spell casting, I think that the biggest piece of advice that I would give people when they first start learning to cast spells, like real spells, or do ceremonial magic, to me, the antidote I'm going to give here would apply to all those categories, is you have to do it. Can't just keep reading about all the things and listening to all the things. Try it. Learn about yourself. Start trying spells. Do some rituals. Try it for 30 days and see if you like it because amazingly, you still have a choice. You could change your mind and decide you don't like that. So then try something else. And the more you learn about yourself and the more you practice putting intention into how you want to live, everything will change. Everything will look different. And then what you want and what you know about yourself will change again.
Yes, I love that because you can always quit. I think a lot of people, when they consider witchcraft or spirituality, they think they're making, a massive commitment. And I mean, if you follow
Mm.
through with it and you stick with it, yeah, it is a massive commitment. But there is nothing wrong with just experimenting. I mean, I agree with the idea. Crowley said this: success be thy proof. I like this. I say
Mhm.
it to people all the time. They're like, I'm not sure if I want to do this. I'm not sure if I believe. I'm like, well, if you're a skeptic and you're not sure, just try it and see what happens. Because if it doesn't work for you, there's no harm in picking another path, right? I have no desire to make people promise to do this forever, right? I just think people should try it. And if it doesn't work for them, I mean, it doesn't work for them. It's not their path. That's fine.
Mhm.
No harm to me. I just think people should consider it. And I think, yeah, that is exactly what people need to hear. And as well, yeah, I mean, you can't see if it's for you until you get out of the armchair, right? This term armchair magician, I don't hear it a lot anymore, but it used to
Oh,
refer
that's
to someone.
interesting. Say that
Yeah,
again. Armchair magician.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, I used to see this online. They would use it to refer to those people who collect like a ton of books and just read them but never do anything. They never get out of the
Mhm.
armchair. I think that's a good term. You don't want to be that person. You want to actually be doing. Of course, research. Like, don't just be like flying on this, like flying in no direction. But getting out of the armchair is kind of important.
You gotta do the thing. And maybe I'm the person that people watch and listen to a lot. I think that that's true because I get a lot of similar questions, and I always just say, "Go try it. Go do it." Or go, if you don't like the outcome, do it again. The only reason why I'm so good at casting spells and rituals is because there's a sheer quantity that I did that didn't work or that I didn't like the outcome, and then I changed it because I can choose.
Yeah, you can always experiment and try new things, and inevitably in your spiritual path you'll make mistakes. I know I have.
Mhm.
But you'll get there eventually. So this is, I think, a really good place to kind of finish off the show. Where can people find you? Where do you exist? And where can people discover more of your work?
Yes, thank you for asking. And again, thank you for having me on your show. I'm so excited to be here. People can find me at moontempleschool.com. That's where all of the mystery school classes are. And of course, there will be a link there to take you to my book or even just my first name, tahverlee.com. And with a name like Tahverlee, you can pretty much find me on any social platform by just typing in my name, which is Tahverlee. And you'll find me in all the places.
Lovely. And thank you for coming on and having this conversation. I think people really enjoy it.
Thank
This
you.
show is supported through Patreon. Join the Patreon, you get a bonus episode 8 times a year, and you get a pre show, which I record individually before my guest hops on. So that's always a fun little bonus. And you can also find me under Georgina Rose or Dot Darling, DAAT Darling, on every social platform. Really, YouTube is where you probably should find me. That's where my best conversations and work lie. And if you are listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. If you are on a podcasting platform, please leave a review unless it is a bad review, in which case do not. And I'll see you guys in the next one. This has been the Postmodern Iconoclast. Have a good day, afternoon, mid morning, mid evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye.